So last night I read this fascinating piece called The Weaponization of Loneliness by Rodham Clinton. Yes, the same Hillary Clinton that was Secretary of State and that ran for president in 2016. The piece, published in The Atlantic, talks about how the right wing has co-opted the lonely American male to radicalize for their political agenda. In this video, I'm going to share with you some paragraphs from this article, review some of the highlights that she brings up, but I'm really curious to hear from you. I want to know what you think. Let me know as you're listening to this what comes up for you, what you agree with, what you disagree with, and yeah. Now, I've prepared a few discussion questions, like we're really getting into it today. So before I begin, I'm just going to read these discussion questions to you and just kind of let these percolate on your mind as you listen. So what do you think is the cause of American loneliness? How has loneliness showed up in your own life? What role does social media play in our loneliness? What role does media consumption play, i.e. like film, TV, video games? What role does labor structures play? This is something I was thinking about, like low wages, exploitative conditions, the 40-hour work week. Like we often don't even have time to connect with one another because we're working so much. What role does geography play? Most American cities, for example, require a car to get around. They aren't walkable, and the walkable cities are the most expensive. So only the rich people really get the access to like direct community. What role does our food consumption and our express package delivery system play? So think about supply chain issues of like normally you would have to go pick up at the mom and pop store or even pick up at the superstore, but now it just gets Amazon delivered directly to your house and it's frictionless. You don't even have to interact with other people. What role does changes to childhood freedom play? I was thinking about how when I was a kid, we played outside. Like we would go to the creek and I would muck around with my friends and we would just have so much fun building forts, building little worlds. And now kids like are just online all the time. You know, you read these articles all the time about how like Instagram and these big platforms are just harming the mental health of children because they have phones from the age that they're like little kids. Like I didn't get a cell phone until I was in high school. I don't know about y'all. Okay, what about for my global audience? Do you notice that these American issues that Hillary talks about, are these like things that we're facing in a vacuum, or do you see these things in your countries and communities as well? And lastly, my last discussion question before we begin, how has friendship, family relationships, and dating changed over time with the rise of tech? How has tech changed this and influenced our loneliness? What about this is uniquely American, and what of these things are global? All right, let's get into the piece. She says, in May, Surgeon General Vivek Murthy published an advisory warning that a growing epidemic of loneliness and isolation threatens Americans' personal health and also the health of our democracy. Murthy reported that even before COVID, about half of all Americans were experiencing substantial levels of loneliness. Over the past 2 decades, Americans have spent significantly more time alone, engaging less with family, friends, and people outside the home. By 2018, just 16% of Americans said they felt very attached to their local community. An epidemic of loneliness may sound abstract at a time when our democracy faces concrete and imminent threats, but the Surgeon General's report helps explain how we became so vulnerable. In the past, surgeon generals have a crucial moment sounded the alarm about major crises and drawn our attention to the underappreciated threats, including smoking, HIV/AIDS, and obesity. This, Hillary Clinton says, is one of those moments. She notes that the rate of young adults who report suffering from loneliness went up every single year from 1976 to 2019. From 2003 to 2020, the average time that young people spent in person with friends declined by nearly 70%. Then the pandemic turbocharged our isolation. She also notes that she's been thinking about and wrote a book about this topic many, many years before it became a mainstream discussion. In 1996, I published It Takes a Village. As First Lady, I was worried that American life had become frantic and fragmented by many people, especially stressed out parents. Social, economic, and technological trends seem to be pulling us apart rather than lifting us up. We were spending more times in our cars and in front of television and less time engaging in communities. Even back then, this is wild that before smartphones, she wrote about this. Even back then, before smartphones and social media, it was evident that Americans were becoming more isolated, lonely, and unmoored from traditional sources of meaning and support, and that our kids were suffering because of this. I was also concerned about the rise of right-wing politicians like Newt Gingrich and media personalities like Rush Limbaugh, who were sowing division and alienation. Around this time, this is when conservative radio shows really started to become a thing. Now we have social media, and so people, are TikTok stars, YouTube influencers. But back then, before smartphones, it was really like the conservative talk show was how these sort of fringe characters really got their day in the sun. Nearly 30 years later, she says, it's clear that the problems I diagnosed in the 1990s ran deeper than I realized and were more dire than I could have imagined. But the prescription in It Takes a Village, putting families first, investing in community infrastructure, protecting kids from out-of-control technology, and recommitting to the core of American values in mutual responsibility and empathy have only grown more urgent and necessary. Does that resonate for you? I really feel like that is so true. I feel like we, more than ever as a culture, don't feel an obligation to take care of one another, which is very troubling. Now, this is really interesting for our high-volume social media users like myself. The Surgeon General points out as well to the crucial role of technology. He highlights data showing that Americans who use social media for more than 2 hours a day are twice as likely to experience loneliness and feelings of social isolation as people who use social media for less than 30 minutes a day. As we spend more time online, we spend less time interacting with one another in person or engaging with our local communities. The more we live in social media echo chambers, the less we trust one another. That's fascinating. And the more we struggle to find common ground with or feel empathy for people who have different perspectives and experiences. That is so true, because the more we're just in our online silos than when we inhabit people either in online or in IRL who have a different viewpoint, we're like, This book she mentions is really interesting too. In his influential 2000 book, Bowling Alone, the Harvard political scientist Robert Putnam showed that American social ties and support networks collapsed in the second half of the 20th century. Many of the activities and relationships that had defined and sustained previous generations, such as attending religious services and joining unions, clubs, and civic organizations, even participating in local bowling leagues, were disappearing. Putnam's more recent work shows that these trends have only gotten worse in the early decades of the 21st century, and that they go hand in hand with intensifying political polarization, economic inequality, loss of trust in our government, and a shift in the national attitude from we're all in this together to you're on your own. One of my favorite TikTokers, who also happens to be my best friend, I Understood, talks about this a lot. This shift from the shift from the individual mindset to the collective, and how we can focus less on me, how can I self-optimize myself, and more on how can I build community, how can I think about my community as a part of and an extension of myself, because we really are all in this together, whether we want to admit it or not. Climate change is coming for all of us. Now, the second half of the piece, she kind of gets into the core of her argument about alienation and loneliness. She talks about how there have always been angry young men alienated from mainstream society and susceptible to the appeal of demagogues and hate mongers. But modern technology has taken this danger to another level. This was Steve Bannon's key insight. So I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to just kind of try to summarize instead of reading as much. So she talks a little bit how Steve Bannon noted that in gaming communities, there was just this incel type man who was very, loyal to their gaming communities, and how he really exploited that. And his goal was, how can I turn all of these gamers into right-wingers? She notes that like many, she was too slow to see the impact that this strategy was having. And as she looks ahead to 2024, she's noticing that people that don't believe in truth, people that are, flagrantly disobeying the rule of law, are being elected to office. She notes that this organization noted that 200 local officials across 6 battleground states have taken anti-democratic actions in this last cycle. Oh my gosh, I'm only at 40 seconds. How do I fit everything I want to say? Only Alex Lopez would find 10 minutes to be constraining. Okay, let me think. So I'm just going to include the frames that I prepared, and then you can just pause and read. This one is really funny because so many people felt this about TV and video games. And it's that's so quaint. This is curious. I'm really curious what you think of this loneliness and disconnection means for our democracy and what happens going forward. Maybe I should make a part 2, because I do have a lot to say about the pandemic that she talks about here. and the impact that it had on our loneliness and our political discourse. Okay, I've officially run out of time. You can pause to read the little frames. Let's talk more in the comments.